Argentina is living today what Brazil experienced 5 years ago. Amid a challenging economic scenario, voters chose a radical political outsider to be their president. Someone who promised to be like a wrecking ball for the political establishment, but also who allied themselves with traditional figures in order to cement their wins. In Brazil, it was the 2018 victory of Jair Bolsonaro. In Argentina, it is the triumph of Javier Milei, who describes himself as an anarcho-capitalist who uses a chainsaw as a symbol of his intentions to shrink the Argentinian state. My name is Gustavo Ribeiro, editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Report, and this is LATAM Live this week. So as usual, when we're talking Latin America, I welcome Ignacio Portes, our Buenos Aires-based Latin America editor. Nacho, thanks for joining me after this massively eventful weekend in Argentina.
Yes, it has been a long campaign, a long year in Argentina, and there's still a lot of things going on and still a lot of things to happen because this transition is going to be intense economically, politically. So good to be here to talk about all of this.
So before we delve into the electoral results and what we should expect from Argentina in the near future, I'd like to ask our viewers to subscribe to the Brazilian Report, which is the journalistic engine behind all of our content, podcasts, videos, live broadcasts. So you can go to Brazilian.report/subscribe for daily original content on Brazil and Latin America. We are an independent website, and in order to help us continue to be independent and to help us grow bigger and become more efficient in covering the region, you can choose one of our membership plans. We have 3 tiers for all kinds of budgets and all kinds of needs. You can get a hold on what's happening in Latin America and Brazil before big international newspapers start covering these stories. But if you are already a subscriber, you can go the extra mile and join our Buy Me a Coffee fan page and offer a cup of coffee to one of our journalists. If you make a monthly commitment, you get exclusive content like special newsletters and a chance to know how we do our journalism. Your name will also be featured on our weekly podcasts. So let's go back to our main story this week. Nacho, it's been a crazy couple of months in Argentina, and at this point, we all know that Javier Milei won 56.44% against Sergio Massa, the economy minister of Argentina and the representative of Peronism, which is this political force that has been at the center of Argentinian politics for the better part of the past century. Now, a political shellacking like this doesn't happen out of nothing. What paved the way for such a striking victory from Javier Milei?
Well, you have to think that there are both national and international factors at play, right? Because Argentina's government has been in crisis throughout its whole 4-year period, really. The Alberto Fernandez administration came back in 2019 with a promise of revamping the purchasing power of salaries for Argentinian workers after a really failed government of center-right Mauricio Macri before him. But the government has been chaotic. It has been full of internal quarrels between the president and his vice president, Cristina Kirchner, who was the main actor of Argentina before Macri in the previous decade. So we've seen 20 years really of in which the Kirchner family was dominating Argentinian politics, and in the last 4 years, that leadership has been in question between the vice president Cristina Kirchner and Alberto Fernandez, and that the whole government has been extremely chaotic and non-functional for most of the term, and this has added to an economic crisis that has been brewing for a decade and getting worse and worse and worse. Inflation has risen to 150%, and it's likely going to go significantly higher, probably twice as much as that next year. The purchasing power of salaries has continued to deteriorate. According to Argentina's poverty rate lines, which are different in each country, so you shouldn't compare Argentina's poverty numbers with the numbers of other countries directly, because each country has its own measurements of poverty, right? But inside Argentina, with its measurements, poverty is higher than it was when Alberto Fernandez took office. So the ruling Peronist administration had every chance of going out, right, in this context. But really in a broader context of the pandemic, that has meant that most governments have not re-elected in Latin America. I think from the last 19 elections, 18 governments have lost, 18 incumbents have lost since 2019. Only a couple of governments are popular in the whole region. AMLO in Mexico, Bukele in El Salvador, but most governments are unpopular. Lula is relatively popular too, for now. But
just as a Kevin, to your point, Lula is much less popular than he was 20 years ago, which, your point, it's like the era of uber popular presidents in Latin America may be over, with a couple of exceptions, but even Lula, who is by far and by any measure Brazil's most popular leader, he also faces a very polarized electorate, even
right. And we've seen in the last 2 decades in Latin America, especially in the first decade of this 21st century, governments that knew what to offer ideologically, what to offer politically. We've seen this so-called pink tide of center-left governments offering progressive politics and some limits to the neoliberal policies we saw in the 90s, and an active state presence to protect the poor, and progressive politics in general, international alliances between these governments, and they all knew what to do, more or less. They had a recipe, everyone, Correa in Ecuador, Lula in Brazil, and so on and so forth. But that idea started to be put in crisis, I think, in the last few years, even though these governments, some of them have continued to hold on to power, and there's been an emergence in the region and in more than the region, in North America too, in Europe, of our nascent right-wing movement that is of a young right-wing movement. I think that's what's interesting. It's that right-wingers used to be old and decrepit and losing and just on defensive, and now they're young and they have the political initiative across the world, or at least across the West, right? And that is what I was saying what I meant when I said this is also an international phenomenon, right? We cannot ignore the international dimension of Trump, Bolsonaro, Cast in Chile, and many more, who are rising figures. Some of them have struggled. We've seen them in government already, so we've seen that it's not the same to be in opposition and just throwing rocks at whoever is in charge than having to actually manage things and seeing the complexity of the real world. And Trump has struggled, Bolsonaro has struggled, and they're out too. But Milei is part of this. He has his idiosyncrasies. He has his own brand. He's a libertarian economical guy who is not exactly the same as Trump or Bolsonaro, but he's definitely part of that movement. That Argentina's economic crisis is much worse than anything mostly anything except maybe Venezuela in the region. So that's a big factor for Peronism's downfall and for the rise of an alternative. But this is also part of something global, right?
No, I mean, as a Brazilian, it's too tantalizing to make the comparison between Milei and Bolsonaro, because it's like when you have cable and your neighbor doesn't, and you're watching a football game and then they scream goal, and like the same goal is going to play out in your television.
Yes.
And for us, it feels a bit like that, because 5 years ago we had a political establishment which was demoralized, in our case, by several widespread corruption scandals, in your case by this dreadful economic scenario. And then this guy, who is an outsider, who many think it's a joke candidate, comes and promises to change everything and to do everything unlike it has ever done before. And he says a bunch of outlandish things. And every time he says like a bizarre statement, political analysts point to that moment and say like, this is when he lost the race, but
actually that's when he won.
Exactly. And I mean, and just like Bolsonaro, one thing it's kind of interesting is that Milei comes strong to the runoff, but then he allies himself with the establishment right. So in Brazil, we saw many of the people who fought with the Workers' Party tooth and nail for the presidency during the 90s say, well, we don't agree with him, but he is the lesser evil, so we're going to fully support him. And we kind of saw that with the coalition led by former President Mauricio Macri, right? And that alliance with Macri, who is a darling to the markets, who is someone who is seen as much more moderate force than Javier Milei, did that change Milei's program in any way, shape, or form?
Yes, everything you said probably. First, this has been a regional dynamic, as you say. What happened with Brazil happened really, if you follow like Colombia's runoff, Rodolfo Hernandez allied himself with the traditional right to try to beat Petro in the runoff. We've seen this nascent right-wing anti-establishment figures when they need a final push, they go for the established, for help from the traditional right-wing establishment of the country, right? We've seen it in many places, and it happened in Argentina too. Milei had an excellent performance in the primary, getting 30% of the vote. Then we have a three-part election in Argentina. Then in the general election, he stagnated, and he stayed at 30% when people were expecting him, analysts were expecting him to rise, to get 35, to keep showing progress, but he stalled. And but that is where he joined forces with Macri and Bullrich and the traditional right-wing establishment of Argentina, splitting the center-right between the centrists and the right-wingers. But most voters went to the right. Most voters followed Macri and Bullrich. Even other centrist candidates signaled support for Milei. I mean, it's always a question whether it was their support that did it, or whether the politicians were just reading the zeitgeist of the moment and saying, this is the guy who's going to win, and if I support him now, I'm going to have a ticket to be part of his government.
Effect, right?
Sorry?
The bandwagon effect, right?
Right. And it's also, and if I support him, I'm going to have a stake in the future government. So this is good for for power, right? And I think Mauricio Macri, the former president of Argentina, saw this coming a little bit. He has changed his public persona a little bit. He has always been a right winger from in his heart, right? A strong right winger. But when he was close to government in 2015, he started to moderate himself ahead of the runoff, and during the campaign, really, he tried to present himself as a centrist technocrat who just wants to get rid of the Kirchner family and have a more reasonable government that is less conflictive and so on. But he never felt fully comfortable with that and with some of his allies, and his government was full of internal quarrels in that regard. And when he failed, he became convinced that the reason he failed was that he was too moderate, economically, especially. And he also started thinking that some of his allies backstabbed him, stuff like that. So, and he started to read the sign of the times. So he really turned from an Obama alignment at the start of his mandate in 2016. Obama came to Argentina, had a lot of meetings with Macri. He was a darling of Obama. To moving in to take pictures with Trump. He visited Trump a couple of times. He started building links with Trump. Trump, in fact, was the guy who financed when Macri had a massive debt crisis at the end of his period. He was the guy that green-lighted the biggest loan in IMF history to support the Macri government until the end and stop him from completely collapsing. He gave him $50 billion, which is a massive amount of money for Argentina. And since then,
he was also in bed with Bolsonaro, who for many in the region was radioactive.
Macri.
Right?
Yes, Macri. Yes. And yes, Bolsonaro was in power at the time, and they felt comfortable. They naturally felt all right when they talked to each other. The tension that you saw between Alberto Fernandez's administration and Bolsonaro was nothing like that during the Macri-Bolsonaro years. So Macri was a bit between both sides, and he has been aligning farther right recently. And he has been a key member behind the scenes of the Milei campaign. Macri played two candidates, really. He favored Bullrich and he favored Milei at the same time in a more coy way. But Milei yesterday, during his campaign, during his acceptance speech at night, I don't know if it was the first person or second person he thanked was Santiago Caputo, who is as the chief of his campaign, as a real mastermind behind the scenes of his campaign. And that is a guy from the Caputo family, which is the best friends of Mauricio Macri, a powerful finance family in Argentina that has always been the behind the scenes, the people that do the behind the scenes dirty work of Macri, both in finance matters and in international alignment matters. So that thank you message was very telling of what really happened during the campaign. I think Macri was always playing, I think, both horses. And if Bullrich won, who was his official horse, great. But if not, he had a B plan with Milei. And now we've seen him, after when Bullrich was out of the runoff, immediately came to endorse Bullrich, as we've told in our newsletter. Macri and Bullrich came to endorse Milei immediately after we had a confirmed Milei versus Massa runoff. And since then it's become obvious, right? But behind the scenes, it was already happening.
Thanks for watching, and subscribe to the Brazilian Reports YouTube channel to follow more of our content. And if you're interested in finding out how this conversation will play out, the entirety of it will be published on Wednesday morning on Explaining Brazil, our weekly podcast. So go to Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts to listen to the entire conversation. Thank you very much.